Well, GM's future in the spotlight at the White House tonight. CEO Mary Barra is quoted as saying a private meeting with the president was productive and valuable. It comes as GM takes the lead in union talks and heat for plant closings.
They said it would never happen. An American automaker standing up to the President of the United States. Unthinkable. But that's exactly what happened. General Motors just humiliated Donald Trump on the global stage, outplaying his America First agenda and rewriting the rules of economic power. This isn't just a corporate decision. Revealed a sweeping global expansion strategy, declaring that it would be investing over $50 billion in new factories, technology hubs, and research centers across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. American plants, the ones that politicians had fought to keep open, would see investments slashed. Instead, General Motors would funnel those resources toward new partnerships in Germany, South Korea, Brazil, and India. They position this move as the future of the auto industry. This is a public power shift, one that shattered Washington's control over American industry in front of the entire world. And now Trump's furious response is shaking Wall Street, Main Street, and every factory in between. So how did GM pull off the biggest corporate rebellion in modern American history? And is this the moment the America First dream finally collapsed? What's happening? GM, the very company that once symbolized American industrial dominance, announced it was moving the majority of its production and research operations overseas. Not gradually, immediately. This was not a cost-cutting measure. It was not framed as a temporary adjustment. This was a permanent, calculated power shift. The company Trump's fury unleashed. Within hours of General Motors' announcement, the Trump administration erupted into crisis mode. President Trump himself took to social media, firing off a series of furious posts condemning the company. He accused General Motors of betraying the American worker, abandoning the country that built it, and siding with foreign governments over its own citizens. Trump's inner circle convened an emergency meeting that same evening. Cabinet members, economic advisors, and senior officials gathered in the Situation Room to discuss immediate retaliation. Multiple options were put on the table: regulatory penalties, federal contract cancellations, and aggressive public shaming campaigns. Trump reportedly demanded a plan that would make an example out of General Motors to send a message to any other corporation considering a similar move. The administration wasted no time. By the end of the day, Trump announced that the federal government would review all contracts with General Motors, one that transcended borders and politics. The announcement triggered immediate global headlines. International markets celebrated the decision, with European and Asian leaders praising General Motors' commitment to global trade. Foreign governments rushed to offer incentives, tax breaks, and regulatory favors to secure the company's long-term presence in their economies. In contrast, the United States government, particularly the White House, was blindsided and humiliated. As the headlines swirled, the world waited to see how the Trump administration would respond. But one thing was clear: General Motors had just humiliated the most powerful man in the country, and there was no going back. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the White House was already preparing its retaliation, threatening to revoke billions of dollars in government fleet purchases. He directed the Department of Commerce to explore antitrust investigations and ordered the Treasury Department to assess the company's tax arrangements. In his public statements, Trump made it personal. He called out General Motors' CEO by name, labeling the company's leadership as traitors who had spit in the face of the American people. Every rally, every interview, every tweet became part of a relentless campaign to vilify General Motors and position the administration as the defender of American workers. But the fury was not contained to the political arena. The economic consequences of Trump's reaction began to spill over almost immediately. Before we dive into that, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, because what happens next will shock you. Wall Street's panic. The financial world does not react well to uncertainty, and the battle between General Motors and the Trump administration sent shockwaves through Wall Street. The day after the company's announcement and Trump's retaliation, the stock market opened to a bloodbath. General Motors stock plummeted by over 20% in pre-market trading. Investors panicked, fearing that the administration's threats of regulatory penalties and canceled contracts would decimate the company's profitability. But the fear extended far beyond General Motors. The entire automotive sector took a hit. Shares of Ford, Stellantis, Toyota, and Honda tumbled as analysts warned that Trump's aggressive stance could trigger a broader economic conflict. Automotive suppliers, steel manufacturers, and technology firms connected to the auto industry also saw their stock values decline. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by over 800 points in a single day, with financial media outlets dubbing it the GM shock. Economic analysts debated whether this would trigger a broader recession, while investors rushed to offload shares in companies that might be caught in the crossfire. Wall Street's panic did not go unnoticed in Washington. Trump's economic advisors warned him that continued escalation could have devastating consequences for the broader economy. But the president was undeterred. For him, this was not about markets. It was about power, loyalty, and sending a message. And as the financial fallout spread, American consumers were about to feel the pain firsthand. How you'll pay for this war. For the average American, the fight between General Motors and the Trump administration might have seemed like a political spectacle, but the consequences were about to hit them where it hurt the most, their wallets. As General Motors shifted production overseas and Trump responded with punitive measures, the American auto market entered a state of chaos. Prices for new vehicles surged almost overnight. Dealerships across the country began raising prices on General Motors models, citing supply chain disruptions, increased import costs, and regulatory uncertainty. But it did not stop there. Competing automakers, fearing they would become the next targets of Trump's retaliation, quietly began to scale back production or delay new model releases. This created shortages on dealership lots, further driving up prices and reducing consumer options. Financing costs also began to rise. As Wall Street reacted to the unfolding conflict, interest rates on auto loans increased, making it more expensive for consumers to purchase vehicles. For many working-class Americans, the dream of owning a new car suddenly became out of reach. The used car market offered no relief. As new vehicle prices skyrocketed, demand for used cars surged, pushing those prices to record highs. Families who had budgeted for a reliable, affordable vehicle found themselves priced out of the market entirely. Meanwhile, maintenance and repair costs climbed as well. The escalating conflict disrupted the availability of automotive parts, leading to shortages and delays. Mechanics began charging higher prices for basic repairs, passing the increased costs directly to consumers. The ripple effects of this economic war extended beyond car buyers. The trucking industry, rideshare drivers, and small businesses that relied on affordable vehicles faced mounting expenses. What began as a corporate decision and a political retaliation had transformed into a financial burden shouldered by millions of ordinary Americans. And yet, as the consumer shock took hold, the battle between General Motors and Trump was only just beginning. The deeper consequences were still to come. The worker betrayal. General Motors' bold global maneuver may have impressed Wall Street and overseas partners, but back home, it triggered a storm of betrayal and outrage. While executives in Detroit were quietly restructuring their global supply chain to shield the company from President Trump's tariffs, American workers became collateral damage in a chess game they never agreed to play. The ripple effects of GM's global strategy began long before Trump's trade war erupted. Years earlier, GM had methodically shifted critical parts of its manufacturing base outside the United States. It started with small cuts, trimming production at plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, claiming the moves were temporary adjustments to streamline operations. But behind closed doors, the blueprint was clear: reduce domestic dependency, lower costs, and weather any political storm. By the time Trump's tariff threats became real, GM was already executing phase 2 of this quiet restructuring. Entire factories, some of which had supported generations of American families, were shuttered. The most high-profile closure was in Lordstown, Ohio, a plant that had been a symbol of American manufacturing strength since 1966. Thousands of workers received pink slips overnight, their livelihoods erased by a strategy they had no part in shaping. GM's move wasn't about failing profits or outdated products. It was about future-proofing the company in a hostile trade environment. The company had calculated that sacrificing American jobs was a small price to pay for securing cheaper labor, global supply chains, and tariff-proof production hubs. The workers, however, saw something very different. Communities that had once thrived around GM plants were left devastated. Small businesses that relied on factory employees watched their customer base disappear. Schools, local governments, and entire city budgets collapsed under the weight of mass unemployment. The social contract between corporate America and the blue-collar workforce had been broken, and the message was clear: profits came first, workers came last. What made the betrayal sting even more was the timing. Trump had promised to bring back manufacturing jobs, to restore American industry, and to punish corporations that outsourced labor. Yet here was GM, one of the country's most iconic automakers, doing exactly what Trump's presidency had vowed to prevent. And it wasn't just one or two factories. It was an entire systemic shift, one designed to make American workers expendable. But the worker backlash was just one part of the unraveling crisis. As the job losses mounted, another battle was brewing, one that threatened to tear apart the very political base that had put Trump in power. Trump's political meltdown, the worker betrayal, set the stage. But it was the political fallout that sent shockwaves through Washington. Trump's America First rhetoric had been built on one promise above all: bringing jobs back to American soil. When General Motors shuttered plants, laid off workers, and moved production overseas, that promise crumbled, and so did Trump's grip on his most loyal supporters. At first, the administration responded with predictable outrage. Trump took to rallies and social media, blasting GM's leadership and accusing them of betraying American workers. He promised retaliation, floated new tariffs, and vowed that the closures would be reversed. But behind the scenes, panic was setting in. Trump's base wasn't buying the rhetoric this time. In Rust Belt, states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, states that had been crucial to Trump's election victory, supporters began to question whether their president had failed them. The very people who had chanted, "Make America Great Again" at rallies were now facing pink slips and shuttered factories. The political fallout grew worse as Trump's efforts to punish GM backfired. His threats of tariffs and regulatory penalties only further rattled Wall Street, contributing to stock market volatility and raising fears of a broader economic downturn. Trump's supporters weren't just losing their jobs, they were watching their retirement savings shrink and their communities crumble. The crisis revealed a fundamental flaw in Trump's strategy. He had built a political movement around the idea that he alone could protect American workers. But when faced with a corporation willing to sacrifice those workers in the name of global profits, his administration's tools proved ineffective. The president's approval ratings in key battleground states began to slide. Allies in Congress grew uneasy, and some quietly distanced themselves from the administration's handling of the crisis. Trump's political machine, once unstoppable, was now faltering under the weight of broken promises and economic reality. But while Trump's base was fracturing, a different shift was happening in corporate boardrooms across the auto industry. The GM battle was sending a message far beyond Washington, and other automakers were listening. Why other automakers are following. General Motors' defiance didn't just shake the political landscape, it rewrote the rulebook for the entire automotive industry. As Trump's administration scrambled to contain the fallout, other automakers quietly took note of how GM had insulated itself from political pressure. What they saw wasn't weakness, it was a blueprint. For decades, American automakers had operated under the assumption that political loyalty mattered. They balanced profitability with public relations, maintaining domestic factories even when overseas production would have been cheaper. Trump's tariffs were designed to reinforce that balance, punishing companies that dared to move jobs abroad. But General Motors proved that there was another way. By restructuring its supply chains, investing in foreign production, and legally shielding itself from trade penalties, GM had demonstrated that corporate survival no longer depended on playing by Washington's rules, and other companies were eager to follow. Ford, Chrysler, and even foreign brands like Toyota and Volkswagen began quietly reviewing their own operations. They analyzed GM's strategy, ran their own risk assessments, and explored how they too could distance themselves from the growing political instability in the United States. Meetings were held behind closed doors, supply contracts were renegotiated, and manufacturing footprints were recalibrated. The result was a subtle but unmistakable shift in loyalty. Where once automakers had prioritized American jobs to maintain political goodwill, they now prioritize shareholder returns and global market access. Trump's aggressive rhetoric and economic threats had not reshored production. They had accelerated the very outsourcing he sought to prevent. This shift extended beyond manufacturing decisions. Automakers began lobbying foreign governments, securing trade deals, and diversifying their supply chains to reduce exposure to American tariffs. The United States, once the unquestioned hub of global auto production, was being quietly sidelined. By the time Washington realized what was happening, the transformation was already underway. Trump's fight with GM had set a precedent. one that reshaped the auto industry's relationship with American politics. The loyalty that had once bound corporations to domestic factories and workers had been replaced by a new allegiance: survival in a global economy. As automakers adjusted to this new reality, the stage was set for a final reckoning: Mexico's manufacturing boom. The aftermath of General Motors' strategic shift did not just impact American soil. South of the border, Mexico quickly became the unexpected winner in this corporate upheaval. As General Motors redirected production and investment, the Mexican manufacturing sector experienced an unprecedented surge in growth. Factories that once stood idle were revamped, new production lines were established, and thousands of jobs were created almost overnight. Mexico's rise in the automotive sector was not accidental. For years, the country had positioned itself as an affordable, skilled manufacturing hub, offering lower labor costs and favorable trade agreements. But it was General Motors' decision to expand its footprint in Mexico that triggered a full-scale manufacturing boom. The company built new plants in states like Guanajuato and San Luis Potosí and expanded existing facilities, funneling billions of dollars into local economies. The impact was immediate. Unemployment rates in Mexican manufacturing towns plummeted as General Motors hired tens of thousands of workers. Secondary industries such as parts suppliers, logistics companies, and local businesses flourished alongside the automotive plants. It wasn't just about jobs, it was about economic revitalization on a scale Mexico had not seen in decades. For American workers, however, the boom in Mexico was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Entire communities in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana watched as their factories closed and production shifted south. While Mexico celebrated a new era of economic prosperity, American towns faced empty plants, declining property values, and rising unemployment. What made Mexico's win even more significant was its ability to integrate rapidly into the global automotive supply chain. By securing long-term contracts and positioning itself as an indispensable player in vehicle production, Mexico cemented its place in the industry's future. This manufacturing boom was not without consequence. It highlighted the widening gap between corporate priorities and the well-being of American communities. But for Mexico, it marked the beginning of a new industrial age. As Mexico's factories hummed with activity, another key player began capitalizing on General Motors' global shift: Europe's entry. While Mexico reaped the rewards of manufacturing expansion, European automakers seized the opportunity to re-enter and dominate segments of the American auto market that General Motors had abandoned. The moment General Motors scaled back its domestic production and diverted resources to foreign markets, European brands saw an opening. Automakers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Stellantis moved quickly to fill the void. Their strategy was simple but effective: target American consumers who felt betrayed by General Motors' decision. These companies offered a variety of new models, competitive pricing, and attractive financing options, positioning themselves as stable alternatives to the chaos unfolding around General Motors. European brands doubled down on marketing campaigns that emphasized reliability, innovation, and customer loyalty. They exploited General Motors' weakened position by highlighting their own commitments to American manufacturing. Volkswagen expanded its Chattanooga, Tennessee plant. BMW invested heavily in its Spartanburg, South Carolina facility, and Stellantis, the parent company of Jeep and Chrysler, launched aggressive promotions to capture disillusioned General Motors customers. The results were staggering. European market share in the United States auto industry surged as American consumers began turning away from General Motors. These companies not only filled the immediate gap left by General Motors, but also secured long-term customer loyalty, reshaping the competitive landscape. Behind the scenes, European automakers also strengthened their supply chains, securing parts and materials that had previously flowed through General Motors networks. This allowed them to scale up production rapidly and meet rising demand without delays. Europe's strategic move was not merely opportunistic, it was calculated and well executed. By stepping into the breach, European automakers reasserted their influence in the American market, ensuring that General Motors' absence would be felt for years to come. As Europe tightened its grip on the American auto market, another global superpower quietly capitalized on the turmoil. A self-inflicted disaster. The collapse of the American auto industry was not caused by foreign competition, government regulation, or external forces. It was a self-inflicted disaster, one rooted in decades of corporate mismanagement, political short-sightedness, and an unwillingness to adapt to a rapidly changing world. General Motors' decision to prioritize global manufacturing over domestic production was the final spark that ignited the fire, but the fuel had been building for years. As the company shifted operations overseas and competitors swooped in to claim market share, the cracks in America's industrial foundation became impossible to ignore. The impact rippled far beyond General Motors. Suppliers, parts manufacturers, and small businesses that relied on the automotive industry watched as contracts dried up and demand plummeted. American workers, many of whom had spent their entire careers building vehicles, were left without jobs or clear paths forward. Entire communities that had been built around automotive factories fell into decline. Property values dropped, local tax revenues shrank, and social services became strained. The American auto industry, once a symbol of innovation and economic strength, was now a cautionary tale of corporate greed and political complacency. What made this collapse even more tragic was that it could have been avoided. Early warnings about the dangers of outsourcing and globalization were ignored. Efforts to invest in domestic manufacturing and worker retraining programs were half-hearted at best. The American auto industry's fall was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by executives and policymakers who prioritized short-term profits over long-term stability. As the dust settled, other casualty of this corporate showdown was about to reveal itself: the death of the American worker, the forgotten casualty. As Wall Street celebrated its newfound allegiance to global corporations, the people who were supposed to benefit from Trump's America First agenda were left behind. Nowhere was this betrayal more apparent than in the heartland of American manufacturing, the middle-class workers who had built their lives around the promise of stable factory jobs. The showdown between General Motors and Trump was never just about corporate profits. Beneath the headlines and financial battles, it exposed a painful reality: the slow, deliberate destruction of the American middle class. Factory closures, outsourcing, and automation had been chipping away at the American workforce for decades, but this conflict made it impossible to ignore. When General Motors announced its decision to shift production overseas, thousands of American workers saw the writing on the wall. Plants that had operated for generations were shuttered. Communities that once thrived on manufacturing jobs faced economic collapse. For many, this wasn't just a corporate decision. It was the death knell of the American dream. The unions that had fought for workers' rights and fair wages found themselves powerless against the tidal wave of corporate globalization. Negotiations failed, strikes were ignored, and promises of new jobs in the electric vehicle sector never materialized fast enough to fill the void left by factory closures. It wasn't just the loss of jobs that stung, it was the loss of identity. For decades, being an American worker meant being part of a system that valued hard work, loyalty, and stability. That identity was shattered as corporations prioritized global markets and shareholders over the communities they once called home. Trump's America First message had promised to reverse this decline. He had vowed to bring jobs back, rebuild manufacturing, and restore the dignity of the American worker. But the showdown with General Motors exposed the limitations of that promise. Political pressure, tariffs, and public outrage could not stop the tide of corporate strategy. As Wall Street celebrated its victories, working-class Americans mourned their losses. And in the wake of this economic conflict, a critical question remained: was the American worker ever truly part of the equation? That question led to a much bigger reckoning: the end of economic nationalism. The battle between Trump and General Motors was more than a corporate showdown. It was a referendum on the entire economic philosophy that had defined Trump's presidency. And as the dust settled, one undeniable truth remained: economic nationalism had failed. From the very beginning, Trump's America First agenda was built on a simple premise: that the government could pressure corporations into prioritizing American jobs, American production, and American consumers. But the conflict with General Motors proved that this premise was fatally flawed. The global economy had evolved beyond the reach of national borders and political rhetoric. Multinational corporations, driven by profit and survival, had learned how to navigate around government policies. Tariffs, public pressure, and nationalist appeals were no match for the cold, calculated strategies of corporate giants. General Motors had shown that it was possible to reject the demands of political power and still thrive. And in doing so, the company exposed the limits of economic nationalism. For Trump, the consequences were devastating. His administration had spent years promising to rebuild American manufacturing, protect American workers, and punish corporations that outsourced jobs. But when faced with a corporation willing to fight back, his tools proved ineffective. The failure of this strategy sent a clear message to the world. The era of economic nationalism was over. Globalization, corporate power, and market forces had won, and Trump, who had built his political brand on the promise of economic resurgence, was left without a clear path forward. This was not just a loss for Trump. It was a loss for the millions of Americans who had believed in the promise of a revitalized economy. The factories would not return, the jobs would not come back, and the economic vision that had defined an era had collapsed under the weight of corporate reality. But now, the question is yours. Was General Motors right to reject Trump's America First vision? Or did this move mark the beginning of the end for American manufacturing? Let us know what you think in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to stay ahead of these massive economic battles and power shifts that the media won't explain, make sure to subscribe and smash that like button. There's a lot more coming and you won't want to miss what's next.